Have you ever grieved a relationship loss? One that didn't end in death? Maybe a friendship that quietly faded and you're still not sure what happened. A marriage or a partnership that ended and left a kind of grief you didn't expect. An adult child who's become distant or estranged. A parent with dementia who is still physically present, but no longer the person you knew. Or perhaps a relationship that never was what you needed it to be. A parent who couldn't offer the love or the safety you deserved. A family dynamic that left a wound that never fully healed. Grief doesn't only come from death. It comes from any significant loss. And relational loss, in all of its forms, is one of the most profound and least acknowledged sources of grief there is. Today, we're going to talk about what grief does in the nervous system, why it can linger far longer than people expect, why some losses seem impossible to move through, no matter how much time passes, and what becomes possible when we work with grief at the level where it is actually stored. Welcome back. I'm Madeleine Lowry, a neural retraining specialist. We're nearing the end of our series on relationships and the nervous system. In our previous episodes, we've talked about how early relational experiences shape the nervous system's default patterns, how certain people activate outsized stress responses, and how unresolved conflict keeps the body in a state of chronic low-level activation. Today, we're going to talk about something that underlies so much of what we've been exploring: grief. Because beneath many of the relational patterns we've discussed, the people-pleasing, the over-responsibility, the difficulty letting go of conflict, there is often grief. Grief for relationships that didn't go the way we needed them to. Grief for connection that was lost, broken, or never fully present. Grief for versions of people we have loved, or versions of ourselves that no longer exist. And that grief, when it isn't fully processed, lives on in the nervous system, quietly shaping everything. Let's begin by broadening our understanding of what grief is. Most of us were taught that grief is what happens when someone dies, and death is certainly one of the most significant losses a person can experience. But grief is simply the nervous system's response to loss, any significant loss. That can include the end of a marriage or long-term relationship, the loss of a friendship, estrangement from a family member, the loss of a parent, not to death, but to illness, addiction, or emotional unavailability, the loss of the family or childhood you deserved but didn't have, the loss of a relationship you hoped would be different than it turned out to be, the loss of someone who used to be, a partner whose personality has changed, a parent progressing through dementia, a friend who has become someone you no longer recognize. Each of these is a real loss, and each of them asks something of the nervous system. One reason relational grief can be so difficult to process is that it is frequently not recognized as grief at all. When someone dies, there are rituals, there is a funeral, there are condolences. Society acknowledges the loss and gives permission to grieve. But when a friendship fades, when a marriage ends, when a family member becomes estranged, when a parent was never emotionally available, there is often no ritual, no acknowledgement, no clear permission to grieve. People may tell you, at least they're still alive, you're better off without them, it was a long time ago, you should be over it by now, or it wasn't that bad. And so the grief goes underground, unacknowledged, unprocessed, but not gone. It lives in the nervous system, often for years, and sometimes for decades. I want to spend a moment on a form of grief that is especially common and especially unacknowledged: the grief of what never was. This is the grief of someone who grew up with a parent who is emotionally unavailable, who is critical, cold, unpredictable, or simply absent. The child in that situation didn't lose a parent that they had. They grieved a parent that they needed but never fully received. That grief is real. It's deep, and it can be particularly difficult to process because there is no clear moment of loss to point to. The loss was ongoing, accumulated over years, and it may never have been named or acknowledged. For many people I work with, recognizing this grief for the first time is itself a profound moment. To understand that what they have been carrying is not simply anxiety or difficulty in relationships or a tendency toward depression, but grief, real, legitimate grief for something they needed and didn't receive. Similarly, there is grief in caregiving situations. When someone you love, a parent, a partner, a sibling, changes due to illness, addiction, or cognitive decline. The person is still present physically, but the relationship you had with them has changed or is changing. And grieving that loss while still caring for the person is one of the most emotionally complex experiences there is. Let's talk about what grief does in the nervous system. When we experience loss, the nervous system responds. In the early stages of grief, this response can be intense. Waves of emotion, physical heaviness, disrupted sleep, difficulty concentrating, a sense of unreality. This is the nervous system processing something significant. And in many ways, those early waves of grief, as painful as they are, represent healthy processing. The nervous system is doing what it is designed to do. But when grief doesn't move through, when it gets suppressed, dismissed, or simply never acknowledged, it can become stuck. Stuck grief tends to settle into the nervous system as a kind of chronic low-level activation. Not the acute waves of early loss, but a persistent background weight. It may show up as a sadness that doesn't lift, a chronic sense of longing or emptiness, emotional numbness or disconnection, difficulty being fully present in current relationships, a feeling of carrying something heavy that you can't quite name. And physically, stuck grief can contribute to the same patterns of nervous system dysregulation we have been discussing throughout this series: immune suppression, fatigue, disrupted sleep, chronic pain, digestive issues. The body holds what the mind has not been able to process. For some people, grief moves through relatively naturally over time. They feel it, express it, and gradually integrate the loss. But for others, particularly sensitive individuals, grief can become lodged. There are several reasons this can happen. Sometimes the loss was never acknowledged by others or even by the person themselves. Grief that isn't named often cannot be fully processed. Sometimes the loss is ongoing rather than complete. It is hard to grieve a living parent who is still present but unavailable. It's hard to grieve an estrangement that may someday resolve. Hard to grieve the slow changes of dementia when the person is still here. Sometimes the grief is layered with other emotions that complicate it. Anger with the person who is gone or who hurt you. Guilt about the feelings you think you shouldn't have. Relief mixed with sadness. Love entangled with pain. These layers can make grief feel too complicated to approach, and so it gets set aside, again and again, until it becomes part of the background, always present, rarely touched. And for sensitive individuals whose nervous systems process experiences deeply and hold on to them tenaciously, unprocessed grief can accumulate over a lifetime, layer upon layer, each loss adding to what came before. Processing grief is one of the most meaningful things that happens in neural retraining work. And I want to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't mean. Processing grief through neural retraining does not mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the loss didn't happen. It doesn't mean no longer caring. What it means is that the emotional charge stored in the nervous system around the loss begins to shift and release. The grief that has been held in a raw, unresolved state begins to be integrated. The nervous system moves from carrying an open wound to holding a scar, something that is part of your story but is no longer actively bleeding. People often describe this shift as being able to think about the person or the situation without being flooded, feeling sadness without being overwhelmed by it, finding that the loss has settled into a place of acceptance, not through discipline, but because the nervous system has finally been able to complete what it needed to complete. For losses that involved relationships that were painful, an unavailable parent, an estrangement, a marriage that ended in hurt, there is often additional work around the complicated emotions layered into the grief. Anger that never had a safe place to land, longing for something that was never received, guilt or shame that became entangled with the loss. As those layers are processed, people frequently find something unexpected on the other side. Not indifference, not erasure, but a kind of peace, a sense of being able to hold the loss without being held by it. And as that happens, as the nervous system releases the weight of unprocessed grief, the body often responds. The chronic low-level activation that grief has been generating begins to quiet, and that creates space for healing that was not available before. Before I close, I want to say something directly to those of you who are living with chronic illness. Many of you have experienced losses that are directly connected to your illness. The loss of your health, the loss of the life you expected to have, the loss of work, relationships, or experiences that illness has taken from you, the loss of the person you were before you became ill. This grief is real, and it is not often talked about in the context of chronic illness. Acknowledging that grief, giving it the space and attention it deserves, is not wallowing. It is an essential part of healing, because the nervous system cannot fully move toward recovery while it is simultaneously holding unprocessed grief about the losses that illness has brought. Grief and healing are not opposites. Processing grief is often one of the most important steps toward healing. If you are carrying grief today, whether from death, from the end of a relationship, from estrangement, from a childhood that left wounds, from illness, or from any of the countless other forms that loss can take, I want you to know something. That grief is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you loved, that you needed connection, that loss matters to you. The nervous system holds grief not because it is weak, but because the loss was real and significant. And the good news is that grief can move with the right support, working at the level of the subconscious nervous system rather than the thinking mind. What has been held for years can begin to shift. Not toward forgetting, but toward integration, toward a place where the loss is a part of your story without continuing to impact your health. In our final episode of this series, we are going to bring everything together and talk about something hopeful. How healing on the inside can quietly transform our relationships on the outside. How changing the patterns in the nervous system can shift the way we show up in every relationship in our lives, without the other person needing to do a thing. If you would like to learn more about this work, please visit tcneuralretraining.com. Schedule a free consultation by phone or take our free quiz. If this episode resonated with you, please follow the podcast, give it a positive rating, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Content of this podcast copyright 2026 by Twin Cities Neural Retraining. Music by Barbara Ben.